Welcome back. Going to be doing another solo episode. Looks like it's going to be for the foreseeable future solo episodes. So I'll do what I can to make sure things stay interesting and try to be as coherent as possible and sitting here talking by myself. So yeah, Seth's just got a busy schedule and it's kind of hindering his ability to record at the moment. So hopefully things will shape up and we'll be able to get back to recording episodes that's not just me blabbing at you. So anyway, hope your quarantine situation isn't too horrible. I'm sitting here on a lovely Sunday afternoon having a bottle of Anchor Steam. It's a San Francisco beer. They just unionized last year, so supporting union beer. So, you know, it's good. It's not bad. I usually drink absolute piss beer, which is like a Midwest trait, I guess. We love shit like Rolling Rock and Hams and High Life and whatnot, so I get shit on out west a lot because these suckers out here love like IPAs and fucking just dark sludge beer that I can't stand. So anyway, so gonna be keeping on with the theme of cooptation and how elite institutions hinder real activism, real progress in social change, any kind of challenges to the status quo. So to kind of recap last week's episode where I talked about how, you know, Twitter's relationship with Black Lives Matter, the hashtag Stay Woke thing, the, you know, McKesson photograph, getting arrested in Baton Rouge after he had been kind of like a consultant for Twitter and trying to pimp out Twitter's bullshit to the black community. Talk about that stuff, how that relates to the old like classic image of the Che Guevara like T-shirt, you know, selling rebellion, you know. So today I kind of want to get into more like psychological elements of this whole process and talk a little bit about Antonio Gramsci, who is kind of like the, you know, he's like the spine holding this project of mine together, sort of. So, like, there's the, you know, Protest Inc. is a great book. I think I mentioned it last episode, and that's been a lot of help as far as specific examples of, you know, what NGOs are partnering with Nestle and Coca-Cola and Walmart and Exxon and all that kind of stuff. But Gramsci really, like, laid out a framework. You know, it's probably not perfect. You know, things change, and he's just one man using what he could get a hold of as far as his memory and whatnot and materials in a prison cell. So he's like known for his prison notebooks. So I mean, he's this hunchbacked little character, was major figure in the Italian Communist Party, imprisoned by Mussolini, and his story. I mean, you can hear Richard Wolff talk about him glowingly. Stories like he was deformed, you know, being when he was very young, and he's from Sardinia, so they were pretty superstitious. And at that time, if they thought, you know, you weren't going to last very long, they would have you sleep in your coffin, like a superstitious old thing. So Gramsci, for, you know, the first chunk of his life or whatever, you know, was sleeping in his own coffin. So just imagine psychologically what that's going to do to a person. First of all, second of all. You know, his introduction to sort of like mass politics and, I guess, left-wing activity was with the general strike. So his whole project, as far as hegemony and consent, spontaneous consent and all that stuff, he was trying to figure out how you could have workers who, it's no secret, like, what they're experiencing. They are the working class. They're getting screwed over by the bourgeoisie, the elite. They are subjected to just, you know, absolute horrendous conditions, bullshit all the time, throughout their lives, okay? Why don't they rebel? Like, what is preventing? Like, they have the numbers. There's a lot more workers than there are businessmen or elites or, you know, bourgeois people. But, I mean, you know, well, the fact that they control the military and all that stuff we'll talk about. But, you know, so there's that fear of violence, but there's something else. And Gramsci was trying to figure out what that component was. And his idea was that while more primitive forms of hierarchies in the past, say like czarist regimes or like feudalism, stuff like that, they would use coercion and violence to force the masses to submit. And now they rely on hegemony, using culture, using language is especially important to Gramsci, you know, and I talked about disarming language in the last episode that I did about the what I call the McResistance, you know, so it goes along with the whole Ritzer's idea of the McDonaldization of society. But anyway, so Gramsci's whole project was how can we explain this, you know, that workers have a consciousness and they're not idiots. And you can go talk to coal miners in West Virginia, go talk to, you know, factory workers in the industrial Midwest, whatever, people that maybe even voted for Trump. You know, they voted for somebody. That's a really good example, actually. They voted for somebody who's a businessman who says he's worth billions of dollars. He's really not, but you know, he is the opposite of these people. You know, he is a, you know, silver spoon in mouth, you know, fucking just rich boy that needed to get his ass knocked out a while ago, but never did. So he's just this pompous buffoon now. But anyway, like I said, he's the opposite of these kind of like salt of the earth, like working class, work with your hands people. So why in the hell would they support somebody like that? And it occurred to Gramsci that it has to do with a sort of either a false consciousness or a dual consciousness. So like a contradictory consciousness. So it's kind of like the idea of like Orwell's double think. You know, you have contradictory beliefs. You firmly believe in something and yet you hold a similar belief, or you hold another belief that totally contradicts it, and you are trying to force these pieces of the puzzle together. So to Gramsci, it's like, why do workers that go to work every day, they toil in the field, they do whatever, and they see with their eyes, they feel, you know, they hear, they're experiencing life, they are conscious of their place and their position, and they're conscious of, hopefully, if they have class consciousness, that the mass of people are workers. And if they wanted to, they could overthrow the system. Why don't they? And it you know, goes back to that whole idea of the false consciousness, or the dual contradictory consciousness. So you have this one consciousness that tells you you're a worker, you're getting screwed over, your fellow workers are getting screwed over, there's more of you than there are of them, you could overthrow the system, that type of thing, like a working class militancy. That's one consciousness. It doesn't even have to go that far. Just the consciousness that you are being subjected to a life not of your design, you know, that you're a part of you're like a piece of machinery in this wider network of elite institutions, which you don't control. So there's that. Then on the other end, there's the consciousness of like what you've been fed throughout your entire life as far as mythology or discourse or, you know, language, like I said, art, movies, music, whatever you're coming into contact with from the elite institutions that's sort of like feeding you this other consciousness, which tells you everything's fine. Like, you know, individualism's a big one. You know, that individualism is an elite value. You know, it's not like workers know that they have to work together, you know, or at least they should. The whole idea of like, I'm going to get to the top, there's room at the top, you know, it's all about me, I'm going to always be self-maximizing, the whole homo economicus thing. You know, that, so these elite values are being fed to the workers in order to keep them in a position of submission. So it's really interesting stuff, and obviously, like, I could talk about Gramsci's prison notebooks this entire time. Consent, you know, like, it's fascinating. So I'm trying to apply that to social movements and why there are so many social movements that are pissed off at the system, and yet the system remains. And it's, from my understanding, it's the sort of like, you know, it's the contradictory consciousness thing. You are aware of what's going on, you're pissed off at it, you might even have anti-capitalist values, and yet you work within the confines of the system because you're under the assumption that you can influence it. And that's sort of like a mythology thing, you know? So it's like the way we think about the Vietnam War is a big one. All the mythology surrounding warfare. Patrick Coy, he did a great piece of work about the anti-war movement having to adapt to different wars, or where our culture was at different periods of time during different wars. So the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, war in Iraq, etc. So, and he also did a fantastic stage model of cooptation. So I'll probably go over the actual like 4 stages of cooptation eventually as well. But with Gramsci, it's, like I said, you used to rely on, if you're an elite, you used to rely on coercion and violence and force to make people submit to you. Now it's hegemonic. It's all like how you're influenced through culture, what you hear in songs, what you see on television, that sort of reinforce these elite values. So that was kind of Gramsci's concern. And as far as the Vietnam War, like I was talking about, mythology like this, the spitting hippie thing. Like, the veterans came home and they got spat on by these anti-war activists. Well, that never happened. There's like no documentation of it at all. And this guy, Jerry Lemke, I think is his name, he wrote the book The Spitting Image. And he talks about that. Like, okay, well, it's a myth. So the hegemonic structure is very interested in like myth making. Can't prove that shit. Never happened. So, but it persists. It's in fucking Rambo. It's in like all these movies, and that reinforces this idea of like, the real victims of the Vietnam War were the guys who got drafted and came back and got spit on by these no good, dirty hippies. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, getting drafted fucking sucks, and it's terrible. But I mean, you're not going to talk about the multitudes of Vietnamese that were slaughtered indiscriminately, men, women, and children. You're not going to talk about dropping herbicide and committing other fucking war crimes, like just like this systematic slaughter of people. So it's it sort of like the elite framing of history is like really important to this whole thing. So there's that, and that in itself, I mean, it like I said, it all has to do with domination. How are people aware of all this shit and yet they don't act? And it's interesting. Like the Vietnam War is a really good example. I'll kind of continue on that note. I think it's like if you think about the mythologies like of JFK. That he wanted to get out of the Vietnam War. That's absolute horseshit. He said no exit without victory. Like he was on the Warhawk board. Like he was on that team. And shit, like what I was actually trying to get at is like the power of protest. Now I am not diminishing the people who marched and protested and were speaking out for peace and all that stuff. That's all well and good, but if you actually look into like what influenced our getting the hell out of Vietnam was, it's like Johnson said, I think in 68, I think Johnson said something like, the elite bastards are bailing on us, something like that. I don't know if that's the right year, but like he said, yeah, he's like, the elite bastards are bailing on us. So like the elite, or the business, he said something like that. Like the business class was abandoning the project. It was getting too expensive. So it wasn't like, maybe these peaceniks have a point. Maybe we're doing something fucking horrific and awful and inhumane. It's like, nah, it's just getting too expensive. And that's sort of, that was sort of like even the liberals had that viewpoint. Like they were thinking to themselves, like, it's not that what we're doing is awful. It's just that it's, we didn't do it as cost effectively as we should have. So it's really, but the mythology says, oh, like JFK and the liberal wing wanted to get out of the Vietnam War, they were against it and all that stuff, and that's why the government killed Kennedy. So all that stupid conspiracy bullshit like falls on its face when you read what Kennedy said. So anyway, the whole idea is that the status quo has to promote itself as legitimate, that its values are legitimate, and that they're natural, and that they're normal. And it really is, like I said, I could talk about this stuff forever. It's I'm just looking at some notes I have, and it's just, so there's a great article by a guy named T.J. Jackson Lears, and it's called The Concept of Cultural Hegemony, Problems and Possibilities, and it was in the American Historical Review in 1985. So if you have access to JSTOR or any, if you just want to look it up, I highly recommend it. But like for example, like Gramsci just expanding on like the Marxist idea of ideology. So I'll just read from the article. For Gramsci, ideology is not merely a system of beliefs that reflects specific class interests. Its development is more complex. The starting point for understanding it is, and this goes on to Gramsci's writing, the spontaneous philosophy which is proper to everybody. This philosophy is contained in one, language itself, which is the totality of determined notions and concepts, and not just of words grammatically devoid of content. So that's an important one. Language, like I said, like if you can manipulate language, and I think George Orwell really hit this really well in his 1984, and I mentioned his essays on political language and stuff. That's really important. Like understanding like that, like the impact of meaning in language. Like they're not just words. They're not just, you know, a sentence is more than just a bunch of connected words. You know, what you say has a meaning, and it like when it is processed by the human brain, it carries with itself like some weight, some density. 2, common sense or conventional wisdom, and good sense, which is empirical knowledge. Popular religion is number 3, and therefore also in the entire system of beliefs, superstitions, opinions, ways of seeing things and of acting, which are collectively bundled together under the name folklore. So, like, what Gramsci's talking about is just, like, even stuff that we take for granted. Like, if you're like me, I'm an atheist, I don't, you know, I don't really have any place for spirituality in my life. However, it's everywhere. People still fucking read horoscopes. You know, people believe in ghosts. People believe in karma. I mean, that's a really popular thing, even with like lefty intellectual types believing in karma, which is like one of the dumbest fucking things ever. Karma. Henry Kissinger's alive. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's anyway. It just goes without saying. Like, the whole folklore thing, sustaining the. I mean, it kind of goes. That's kind of how like fascism works too. If you look at fascism. What helps sustain it is a sort of mythology. Like that's why the Nazis were like interested in the occult and in magic and like pagan rituals and shit like that, you know. So anyway, the spontaneous philosophy has to do with like all the prejudices, all the sentiments, like everything. So just imagine, I guess, in American culture, like the values that we have put before us all the time for us to swallow. You know, the military being involved in sports is a big example. I mean, it's the militarization of civil society is like I think is a predominant American value in our hegemonic system. You know, like we're the whole support the troops thing, back to the Coy article, talking about even in protesting the wars, for example, the anti-war movement adopted what the pro-war people were saying. Support the troops. Oh, you don't support the troops. And the peace movement said, well, no, you don't support the troops. So it's like, you know, they're still carrying that notion of we have to support the troops, and that's like the thing though. It's like, well, wait, why? Like I understand if you get drafted and you're put into a horrible situation, yeah, that sucks. That's not your fault. You know, you got screwed into that situation, but if you're aware of what the United States military is doing, all the horrible shit that we do abroad, and you still sign up to go serve, you know, and obviously there is what's called the drafting of the poor, drafting of the impoverished, like people that are desperate. Like, don't get me wrong, like I have a lot of members of my family that have joined the military because, you know, they didn't have a choice. That was their outlet. They wanted to go to college, couldn't afford it, that type of thing. So that happens. But I'm just saying, like, other than that, though, I think everybody, at least at some point in their life, in high school, I can't tell you how many people were like, yeah, I'm going to go fucking kill some terrorists. That type of thing. Like, in their military recruiters are there. They think it's badass. Like, while there are people that join out of desperation, there's a lot of people that join because they just want a fucking license to do fucked up stuff. And the other thing is that's also, I'm going to ramble. This is what happens when I am just sitting here talking by myself. That's also why the military is so opposed to free college, is that a lot of people will join the military because they want to go to college, and they can't afford it. So they join the military, and of course the military is going to say, what, you're going to cut off like our the flow of people joining because they can't afford to go to college. You can't do that to us. But anyway, it's all fascinating stuff. So what I want to talk about next is like specifically like what is the psychological condition as far as cooptation? Like why, how does all that fit in as far as not using coercion to force people into a certain situation, to force them to submit? So, like I said, in the past, dominance was based on violence, coercive measures, like I mentioned, czarist regimes, feudal regimes, etc. So the difference now is that the elite have found that, especially with like the wide expanse of media now, that they don't want to be seen as unethical. The elite don't want to be the ones like, they don't mind, they'll do it if they have to. It's like Gramsci even says, like the force is still implicitly there. The violence is implicit. It's like if they want to fuck you up using the military or the police, they'll do it. Don't get me wrong, but they prefer to put on this image of they're ethical. They're the masters of mankind. They're where they are at because they have the right brains for the job. And anyway, they like I mentioned, they don't want to appear on TV as Bill Gates fucking sent soldiers to put down a strike or something like that. Anyway, so I guess I should say Jeff Bezos because he's the one dealing with more strikes at the moment, which is good. So as far as co-optation goes, there's a specific study that was conducted at the University of Iowa, and what they did was they took groups. They had different little groups of 5 people, I think, something like that, and they would designate people leaders, and a leader is like what would be an elite. Okay, so the leader of the group could either they had like a certain amount of money. They could either take money away, which is like a punitive measure, or they could use resources to reward particular people. And anyway, in short, what the study found is that they would use the reward system as like a dividing mechanism. That because there would be like unrest within like the 3 or 4 people that weren't leaders. Like they felt like they were getting fucked over, and the whole study was designed to make that happen, obviously. So they would feel like they were getting fucked over, and in order to divide them and make sure that because they could have formed, I guess you could call it a union. They called it something else. I'm trying to remember what they called it. I'm looking at my notes. I can't remember. Okay, anyway, so they could have formed a group, and in essence, the group would have allowed them to have like an equal say in the situation as the leader. So how did the leader prevent that? They started rewarding particular people in the group, and that person, once they were given like a certain amount of more funds or whatever, they would start arguing on behalf of the leader. And they found that was like a consistent thing, that if the leader, instead of taking a punitive measure against a group or against somebody who was like a particular, I guess like a challenger, you could say, they would just take that challenger and they would say, well, how about I just give you a little bit of this extra, and you sort of, they didn't actively say like, hey, you start saying things on behalf of the leadership. But what they found was that, yeah, the rewarded person would stop being aggressive or would stop trying to challenge the leader. And I really butchered that. I'm just trying to word this as properly as I can without like totally misconstruing the entire situation. But anyway, so that kind of speaks to what I'm talking about as far as like professionalization, what's happening to activist leadership, and how like the mythology sort of sustains itself, that peaceful protest and activism within the system can change the status quo when it cannot. So with I think that study, the University of Iowa study, really showed that like how the elite are currently doing it, as far as like, oh well, instead of and Protest Inc. mentions this a lot, instead of punishing people, will give them an outlet within the system that totally just makes them impotent. So your movement totally dies. It becomes moderated. It becomes institutionalized because you're working within the system now. How you cannot change it from within. I mean, there's an argument to be made about the whole long march to the institutions and stuff like that, trying to get left-wingers into positions of influence, and that's kind of like Gramsci's answer is, we have to build our own counter-hegemony. We have to be able to build our own sort of like mythologies and our own sort of like working class folklores and have our own organic intellectuals in order to combat the false consciousness that we have under the current hegemony, the capitalist hegemony. So anyway, that's I think it's really fascinating, and when you talk about the cooptation or the colonization, I like the word colonization for the co-opting of social movements, because it really is like an invasion. Like, I think I might have mentioned the. See, it's funny. I record these episodes and I totally forget what I talked about. The community mediation movement. How community mediation started as like wanted to be an alternative to the justice system, which is seen as racist, top-down. People plead guilty when they know they're innocent just to avoid like a trial and all that stuff. Yeah. So. Or to avoid a sentence that's harsher than what they're promised that they'll get if they just say that they're guilty. So the community mediation movement tried to establish itself as an alternative, and then before you know it, it got co-opted by the court system. And I'm telling you, like, if you read Gramsci's feelings about language and the importance of like meaning and words and everything, and I talked about how NGOs in Latin America would, North American and European NGOs would go to Latin America and sort of infiltrate these leftist movements or these radical movements, and they would use the words empowerment or revolution or to whatever. They would use those words, but they would drain them of meaning. And once you do that, I mean, it's exactly what you're seeing in the United States right now. I mean, I don't want to knock Bernie Sanders, because that's becoming like fashionable. He's now that he's out of the race and he's doing exactly what people said, well, what he said he was going to do from the beginning, which it pissed me off, that he was going to endorse Biden and all that, or whoever the nominee would be. It's really fashionable to bash him, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but at the same time, it's, that's what happens when you try to work within the system. It does not fucking work. They've been trying to do that for a long time. And yeah, I mean, that's his saying, we're going to have a political revolution. Okay, well, what happened? So it's, and that's kind of what I'm talking about as far as like draining words of meaning. That's not a revolution what just happened. You can call it a movement, sure. I mean, I think it ignited a lot of people's interest in left-wing and alternative politics and stuff like that, but I absolutely would not call what Bernie had a revolution. So anyway, I'm telling you, I really think the establishing like the subordinate mindset in people is key. Like, you'll talk to different working class folks, and they'll either acknowledge that the system is fucked and that they're getting fucked and say there's nothing I can do about it, or they take on the more like masochistic mindset of, if I wanted to do better, I could do better, but I'm not. And I think what that translates to is sort of like a feeling of wanting to feel like you have control over your life. If you have that feeling of, yeah, I'm poor, I fucking live in a shitty apartment, or I live in a trailer park, whatever, and I bust my ass at work and I get paid beans. It's like, you can either say, man, I'm fucked and the system is screwing me over and there's, nothing I can do about it, like it's a hopeless situation, or you can say, if I wanted to be rich, I could be rich, or I'm not smart enough to be rich and that's why I'm not rich. I'm a grunt worker because I don't have what it takes, and the people that are rich deserve to be rich, which is a masochistic mindset, but it also is like saying, I did this to myself, or the factors leading up to this point partially were because of me, who I am, the choices I've made, whatever. So it makes sense. Like, while at the same time, it's like, okay, well, it's sad to think of somebody having that belief. Like, yeah, I fucked up my own life. It's sad to think that, but it's like also, hey, people want to feel like they're in control, and people are increasingly not in control of shit in their lives. And this coronavirus situation, or COVID-19, or whatever you're supposed to call it, is really, I think, showing people it's driving up levels of anxiety, isolation, feelings of powerlessness and stuff like that, because you start realizing that this is sort of like the market system is not built to sustain human life. It's not prepared for it, and it's out of control. There's like no, you can pump a lot of money into it, but it's just going to collapse again, and everything that's going on is really a lack of control. So it's the true fascism or the true like authoritarianism of the system is not so much in how regulated it is, but how deregulated it is. It's how it's put together with fucking bubblegum and duct tape, and it's supposed to function to better human life, and it does not. And that's what we're seeing now with the COVID situation. So anyway, that's yeah, I've blabbed. I in reading Gramsci, I'm writing this paper. I'm trying to hopefully get it published eventually. It's about 40 pages right now. I've got more shit to add to it. But yeah, it's disappointing looking at what's going on in the news, because I think my point's made pretty well with the people who are protesting to open businesses back up that aren't the like fucking TGI Fridays franchise owner. Like the actual workers that are out there protesting, which I don't know how many there are, but the ones actually out there, like in Ohio, knocking on was it were they at the Capitol building? Where the hell were they? They were somewhere, but there's like their faces are all pushed up against the fucking glass door, and it's like, okay, man, well, you're doing the work of the business class for them. Like, they want to open up businesses because they don't give a shit whether or not you get sick. So so these people that are working class, like, of course they want to go back to work. Of course they want to get the hell out of their house. They want to do stuff. They want to actually feel like they're being of use to their community, whatever. They want to make money. They don't want to feel insecure about like whether or not they're going to have a job once this is all over. They want to go back to work. But what they should be doing, what workers need to be doing right now, is using this time to organize digitally, whatever. Like the Labor Notes conference is digital this year. I think it was this weekend, actually. There's a lot of different opportunities for learning how to organize through Zoom or whatever the hell program you want to use, as far as like communicating with people in quarantine. So what workers need to be doing now is figuring out how to effectively unionize, or just not even like officially unionize, but sort of carry out what could be like a general strike for however long it needs to be. I think that's the only way, as far as like once we get out of this, there's sort of two paths, that we can take after this coronavirus situation, after this quarantine. One road is we start organizing a militant working class movement, sort of taking picking up the ball and running with it from where Bernie Sanders got knocked down. It's like the idea. Like, how can we take that, what we've learned through organizing and the Bernie movement and all that stuff, how can we take that and run with it? Some people have talked about keeping the whole like Bernie donation thing and mail lists and all that stuff, sort of like sustaining that, using that as a platform. I don't know. I think Bernie is kind of irrelevant right now. Now, unless he starts saying shit like we need to have a rent strike, we need to have a general strike, we need to have a militant working class movement, that's not going to be what he's saying, though, because he's going to be spending all of his time trying to make sure that Biden gets elected, and that's another even like crazy fuck situation that who the hell knows. So we can take that path. We can take the path of like a militant working class movement, or we take the path of business as usual, and everything opens back up, and everything's the fucking same, which that is terrifying and unacceptable, because at this point in time, we already fucking know about pandemics. We've known about them for a long time. We've known about viruses for a long time. We already know about all this stuff, what they're capable of doing, shutting down our economy and all sorts of stuff, shutting down the world. So we're already aware of like what can be done by something like this, a global catastrophe or a pandemic, whatever. And if we just allow ourselves to just be lulled back into business as usual, it's just courting disaster again. You're courting extinction. So those are the two paths. I don't know how highly organized we're going to be able to be as far as, being digitally organizing. That's like a whole, that's a whole project in itself. I hope people are at least trying. I know there are quite a few people who are trying. Like I have been in touch with some folks from the Bernie Sanders campaign, all the paid organizers, and they are starting to talk about things like salting. They all of a sudden they have organizing chops, so they can start infiltrating warehouses and factories and docks, whatever the hell they want to do, start organizing workers, which I think is a great idea. Okay. That being said, projects like that have happened in the past as far as professional organizing goes. It's not. I'm opposed to. The whole thing I'm writing about as far as like cooptation has to do with the professionalization of organizing too. I was a paid organizer for AFSCME, and it's so you're put in a position where, which of course, like as a salter, you're kind of working with a union. That's like optimally. You want to have like that kind of support and organization and materials and whatnot. But like, when I was an organizer with AFSCME, I would go into offices, break rooms, whatever, talk to workers about the union, and it was organizing state employees to try to get the collective bargaining bill passed, which ended up happening. But I didn't have skin in the game. I was just a paid fucking organizer. I was some jagoff that would just show up at their offices or their wherever, hospitals, adult mental health services, DMVs, wherever, Department of Agriculture, wherever I would pop up, and I would just start talking to people. It was like, okay, now you should do this for your own good. And it's like, I don't know, there's a condescending element to it, and I don't think that's the proper way to organize. But with salting, you're actually working with those people. So it's different, but you don't want to be confined by the institutions, the elite institutions, and developing like organic movements and organic intellectuals, like Gramsci would say. I think it's going to take more than ex-Bernie organizers infiltrating workplaces and stuff like that. So we'll see what happens. But the topic of hegemony and consent, I think, are really appropriate today, because if you consider the whole coronavirus situation, COVID-19, quarantine, pandemic, all this stuff, I think it has the potential to really shake faith in the system. That all the things that you've been told about this country being so prepared, you can watch Trump's little conferences that he does. He'll pop up there and be like, oh, we don't need these ventilators. We have these ventilators. We got all these ventilators and we don't need them. And it's like, fucking all those people dying in New York say different. We were so underprepared for this fucking thing, but his whole career as a politician, if you can call it that, now depends on people thinking that he did a good job or that he was prepared, which is absolutely not true. He's totally unprepared, didn't give a fuck about it, heard about it, it didn't matter, wanted to keep the businesses open so he could still say we got the greatest economy. He's saying we got the greatest economy, the world's never seen an economy like ours. It's like, Jesus fucking Christ. So, that's the other funny thing about the whole like mythology and folklore and hegemony thing, is that it's the fake news thing, the whole post-truth concept, that we're in this whole, like, we have reached a point where there's so much information out there, we all have access to it more or less through computers and phones and whatnot, books, obviously, we still have libraries, just so everybody knows, it's like the access to all that stuff doesn't even fucking matter, because there's so much of it that it's so overwhelming that we don't even want to look at it. And so anytime somebody fucking wants to sort of like push an assumption, America's the greatest country in the world, we have the best economy ever, like all that shit, it doesn't even matter. It's like, and that's sort of like the whole the plethora of conspiracy theories that have popped up. You know, I mean, of course, like there was the New World Order shit going on in the 90s and all that, you know, the Bohemian Grove and all that shit. But, I mean, it's really, the whole, like, zeitgeist movement and all that crazy shit, the LaRouche types, David Icke, like, Alex Jones goes without saying. The whole post-truth thing has, I think it is really, it embodies like where we're at as far as like hegemony goes. It's like the system doesn't even have to try anymore. It's instead of like putting forth like a coherent image of what's happening or an ideology, it's like our ideology is incoherence. Can't connect the fucking dots. And I chalk that up to a decline in the American left. I think that the left in this country is become disorganized. It's, you know, the new left really sort of fucked everyone over by ignoring the actual point of capitalism's contradiction, which is labor, you know, at work. And I think like because of that we have all these conspiracy theories popping up just to try to explain everything, and it's always with like a right-wing bend. Like it's always like, well, like Alex Jones says globalists. Well, what the hell do you think he means when he says globalists? You know, like it's all the fucking protocols, the Elders of Zion shit is like very much ingrained in the sort of like conspiratorial American culture. So that's like the new folklore. You know, people will talk about the Bilderberg meetings. People will talk about, like I said, Bohemian Grove. They'll talk about the Rothschilds. They'll talk about all this shit, and it's just incoherent. It's like, okay, so yeah, rich people run shit. That's true. But they can't explain like the mechanisms of how everything's working, and that's kind of like what Gramsci was trying to do. How do those rich motherfuckers control everything? And, you know, my belief at this point is that they have sustained a sense of like incoherence in the working population. So, that is sort of like my tangent. Let me have a sip of this Anchor Steam here. Yeah, I mean, so kind of, I mean, I don't even see a need to recap. I kind of just said the same thing over and over again, didn't I? But yeah, with that study, you know, I like I said, the study in the University of Iowa, I think that's fascinating. They showed that you get more out of rewarding people and dividing them rather than collective punishment or punishing one person, because then if you punish one person, that person can become a martyr. You know, it's sort of like I guess Foucault kind of talked about that type of stuff as far as punishment goes. Well, they've found that punishment doesn't really work very well. I mean, we still have a fucking terrible prison system and whatnot, but that's for poor people. And typically, you know, there are vast exceptions, I think, but, you know, really activism, especially like professional activism, has become, I think, more or less a sort of like bourgeois activity in a way. There's sort of like the privileged class is sort of the ones who infiltrate I shouldn't even say infiltrate, that makes it sound insidious, but the people who end up taking part in things like MoveOn.org campaigns or whatever, like me, like, you know, I come from a working class background, but it's odd for somebody to see like an actual like working class, like fucking son of a coal miner type situation or daughter of a coal miner or whatever, get involved in professionalized activism. And I think that's because it's not organic, and they are actually engaged in real conflicts as far as class goes, you know, strikes, for example, different stuff like that, or they don't even have time, or again, like it's that feeling of powerlessness. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to talk about, but yeah, I hope, like I said before, I hope your quarantine situation is not too terribly bad. It's really boring. That's like the worst thing about it. Been trying not to, you know, it's really easy to sort of slip into a pattern of indulging in booze or cannabis products incessantly. just to sort of escape the boredom, the how tedious. Who would have thought a pandemic would be so boring? But anyway, yeah, we'll see what's happening. I foresee this thing going on for quite a lot longer than they're saying. This whole, we're going to open up the economy in May. Fucking idiots. Here's my prediction. Before I close, I'll give you this. My prediction is, if they are stupid enough to open up the economy prematurely, and I use that whole open up the economy thing, not ironically, but I it's what they say. I think it's a stupid way to put it, but anyway. If they try to do it prematurely, I guarantee you it's going to be in places like fucking Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, the South. Texas, Arkansas, like all those states that have that, like, I don't give a fuck type of attitude. Karen wants her curly fries. All those states will have a fucking massive spike in COVID-19 cases and deaths. And we'll have to quarantine all fucking over again because these idiots want to open up businesses early or prematurely. So that's my prediction. If these schmucks open up businesses and people start going about shit like nothing ever happened, they're going to get infected, there's going to be more cases, there's going to be more deaths, and we're going to have to put this shit on lockdown all over again because these fucking imbeciles can't go without a visit to the goddamn Cheesecake Factory. So it's like, anyway, that's my prediction. So I will leave you with that. You take care now. Be safe. Keep your mind occupied. Keep reading. Make sure that you are not turning into sludge. So until next time, take care. Bye-bye.